Pushpin disclaimer: this story is a work of emotional fiction inspired by real-life experiences. It contains themes of infidelity, heartbreak, emotional conflict, and personal awakening. The purpose of this story is not to promote or justify betrayal, but to explore the complex emotional landscape of relationships, the pain of broken trust, and the struggle for healing. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Viewer discretion is advised. For 10 years, I believed I was living inside the kind of marriage people envied from a distance. My name is Rachel, and like any devoted wife, I poured everything into building a life with my husband, Daniel. We had a cozy little home in Connecticut, 2 beautiful children, and a photo album filled with smiles that felt real until they didn't. Daniel was charming, ambitious, and always knew how to make me feel seen, at least in the beginning. He would text me in the middle of a busy day just to say he missed me. He brought me flowers every third Friday, claiming it was our mini anniversary. We laughed over wine, held hands under the covers, and made love like we were still discovering each other. Those were the moments I clung to when things began to change. The truth is, I had always drawn a very clear line in my mind. No matter what happened in our marriage, I would never betray him. Not emotionally, not physically. That was the promise I made on our wedding day, the vow that I carried like a sacred oath in my heart. Even during our arguments about money, parenting, career decisions, I held onto that line. I thought he did too. But something shifted. I can't say exactly when. It was subtle at first. He started coming home later than usual, brushing me off with work stuff. He smiled less, touched me less, and suddenly his phone never left his side. Still, I kept telling myself, this is just a phase. We've been through worse. We'll come out stronger. Friends would compliment us. You two are perfect together, they'd say, and I'd nod, holding my smile like a mask. Because deep inside, I was already starting to question everything. Were we really perfect? Or was I just refusing to see what had always been broken? Looking back, I think the scariest part wasn't that Daniel might have been lying to me, it was that I might have been lying to myself. I was the one who refused to look at the signs, who desperately wanted to believe love was enough. I clung to our memories, to the promise I swore never to break, as if they could shield me from reality. But life has a way of forcing you to see the truth, no matter how tightly you close your eyes. And when that truth finally came, it didn't knock. It shattered the door. It didn't happen overnight. That's what hurt the most. It was gradual, like watching a flower slowly wilt without understanding why. Daniel wasn't cruel, or loud, or even distant in ways that were easy to explain. But something inside him had undeniably shifted. At first, I noticed the absences. The way his good morning kisses became quick nods. How his I love you texts turned into vague one-word responses. He started leaving early, coming home late, saying things like, the firm is swamped, or the new client's demanding. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Because that was easier than imagining something worse. He used to sit beside me while I made dinner, just talking, laughing, even stealing bites before the food was ready. Now he stayed in his office, door shut, claiming he had work to finish. We stopped watching our favorite shows together. He would be on his phone more often, and when I'd glance over, he'd tilt the screen away, just enough to make me wonder if I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, we were adults. We had kids. Responsibilities. Stress was natural, right? But it was more than stress. It was detachment. One evening, while folding laundry, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. It was from a fancy bar across town, a place we'd only been once, years ago, on our anniversary. The timestamp said 11:43 p.m. He told me he had been working late at the office that night. I stared at the receipt for minutes, debating whether to ask him about it. When I finally did, he just laughed it off. Oh, that? Just met a couple of colleagues for a quick drink. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. That was the first time I felt that tightening in my chest, the pressure of doubt. I couldn't prove anything, but something in his tone felt rehearsed. Calculated. Then there were the showers. Longer. Later. Always followed by him locking his phone in his drawer. He started wearing cologne again, Not the usual kind I bought him, but something new. Something musky and bold. I asked about it once. He said he got it as a free sample. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Because I still wasn't ready to admit what was becoming more and more obvious. Instead, I began blaming myself. Maybe I'd let myself go after the kids. Maybe I wasn't interesting anymore. Maybe I was boring. I tried harder, cooked his favorite meals, wore lingerie, planned date nights. But the more I reached, the further he drifted. There's a kind of loneliness you feel when someone's still physically next to you, but mentally, emotionally, they're in another world. I was still clinging to hope. Still thinking, I made a vow. I won't let this break us. But I had no idea just how far he'd already gone. And how close I was to crossing a line of my own. It was a Wednesday, one of those overcast, quiet days that drag on with nothing special to remember them by. Daniel was in the shower and his phone, for once, was left unattended on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't even think to touch it. But that day, something in me shifted. A strange silence had been growing between us for weeks, and my gut refused to ignore it any longer. I picked it up with trembling hands. It wasn't even locked. That part still haunts me, the ease with which the truth unraveled. There was a string of messages from someone saved as Alex, a gender-neutral name, probably chosen on purpose. But the words were clear. There was nothing platonic about them. Last night was everything. I can still feel you. She doesn't suspect anything, does she? I wish I could fall asleep next to you every night. The world stopped spinning. I don't remember how long I stared at the screen. Time felt like water slipping through my fingers. The sound of the shower faded into a dull echo in the background. My breath became shallow. My heart, an anvil in my chest. I knew I should have taken screenshots, maybe sent them to myself, confronted him right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I placed the phone back, quietly, carefully, like I was afraid to wake a sleeping monster. I walked out of the room and sat on the living room couch, staring blankly at the fireplace. He came downstairs moments later, towel around his neck, looking refreshed, humming a song I didn't recognize. He kissed the top of my head like nothing had changed. But everything had. I didn't say a word that night. I couldn't. There was no script for this, no guidebook on what to do when your heart is ripped open by the person you trusted most. I barely slept. My mind replayed every recent moment, every lie he told, every shift in behavior, every time I blamed myself. And now, the messages echoed over and over in my head. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Deep. Planned. He had built something with someone else while I sat at home believing in vows and loyalty. And still, I didn't leave. I wanted answers first. I wanted to see how far he would go. Would he confess? Would he lie if I asked directly? Was there still a piece of my husband left under the wreckage? But most of all, I wanted to understand how we got here. How I got here. Because even in the middle of that storm, one thought kept tugging at the edge of my conscience. If he could do it, why did I keep pretending I wouldn't? The line I once swore never to cross was starting to blur. And it terrified me. The days after discovering the truth were like living in slow motion. I went through the motions of life, getting the kids ready for school, managing work emails, folding laundry. But inside, I was unraveling. Every time I looked at Daniel, I saw a stranger. His smile seemed like a lie. His voice felt rehearsed. I kept wondering how long he'd been doing this, how many times he'd come home to me with her perfume still on his clothes. How many lies I swallowed while he lived a double life. I didn't confront him right away. Maybe I should have. But I needed time to process. I needed to understand the anger swelling inside me, anger that felt dangerous, foreign. I was raised to believe in forgiveness, in marriage, in second chances. But what do you do when the person you built your life with sets fire to it without warning? One evening, as I was unloading the dishwasher, I dropped a glass. It shattered into 100 pieces on the tile floor. I stood there frozen, staring at the broken shards, and then I started crying deep, guttural sobs that I hadn't allowed myself to release since the moment I read those messages. Daniel rushed into the kitchen. What happened? Are you okay? I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw every plate at him and demand, how dare you ask if I'm okay? But I didn't. I just knelt to pick up the broken glass, my hands shaking. He tried to touch my arm, and I flinched. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while he snored beside me like nothing had changed. But everything had. And the worst part? I couldn't even mourn properly. Because I wasn't sure if I wanted to save our marriage or burn it to the ground. Friends I confided in were divided. Some said, fight for it. He made a mistake, but love can be rebuilt. Others told me leave. If he betrayed you once, he'll do it again. But none of them were in my shoes. None of them felt the heat of betrayal bleeding into the coldness of a shared bed. And that's when I started to feel something else, something I hated myself for. Curiosity. What if I did let someone else in? Not out of revenge, not to even the score, but just to feel wanted again. To be looked at like I mattered. To be held without suspicion or secrets. I still hadn't crossed the line. Not yet. But I was walking dangerously close to it. The vows I once held sacred now felt like handcuffs. And I began to question everything: my values, my strength, my marriage, and the person I thought I was. Because when someone steps over the line, they don't just break your heart, they make you question if the line ever mattered in the first place. It started innocently. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. His name was Caleb. We worked in the same building, different departments, but occasionally crossed paths in the break room or elevator. He was kind, always had been. The kind of man who noticed the little things. Like when I changed my hairstyle. Or when I wore a color I didn't usually wear. Unlike Daniel, who hadn't really seen me in months, Caleb did. One afternoon, I was sitting in the company cafe, barely picking at my salad, lost in thought, when Caleb approached my table. "You look like you're a million miles away," he said gently. I forced a smile. Just a rough week. He didn't press. He didn't pry. He simply sat down with his coffee and kept me company in silence until I was ready to speak. That alone made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: safe. Over the following days, he started showing up more often. Or maybe I just started noticing him more. He brought me coffee exactly how I liked it: 2 creams, 1 sugar. We joked, we talked about life, and slowly, our conversations deepened. It wasn't flirtatious. Not at first. But it was comforting. Easy. One day, after a particularly sleepless night filled with tears and silent resentment, I found myself venting to him. About life. About Daniel. About feeling invisible. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his eyes, his body language. He leaned in like every word I spoke mattered. Like I mattered. "I'm sorry," I said at one point, wiping a tear. "You didn't sign up to be my therapist." He smiled. "You don't have to apologize for feeling things, Rachel. You're human. And you're allowed to be heard." That sentence stayed with me. You're allowed to be heard. Daniel hadn't made me feel heard in months. But this man, this near stranger, made me feel seen in a way my own husband hadn't in what felt like forever. It wasn't love. And it wasn't lust. Not yet. But it was dangerous. Because I started looking forward to seeing him. I started checking my reflection before I left for work, wondering if he would notice my new earrings or the way I styled my scarf. I hated myself for caring. But I still cared. And one night, when I received a simple message from Caleb: "You deserve better, you know that, right?" I felt something shift inside me. Not because he said it, but because I believed it. I didn't reply. I couldn't. That line, the one I swore I'd never cross, I was standing at its edge, staring into the unknown. And for the first time, I didn't feel scared. I felt alive. It was raining that night. The kind of cold, steady rain that blankets the world in silence. Daniel and I had another fight, this time over something trivial. A missed parent-teacher conference, though it wasn't really about that. It was never about the thing we argued about. It was about everything else we refused to say. I asked him if he still loved me. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Why are you being so dramatic, Rachel?" That was his answer. Not yes. Not no. Just dismissal. I remember standing in our kitchen, drenched in frustration and loneliness, thinking, how did we become this? 2 people coexisting under the same roof, orbiting each other without ever touching. He walked upstairs. I didn't follow. Instead, I grabbed my coat, my keys, and left. I didn't have a destination. I just needed air, space to breathe, without the weight of disappointment crushing my chest. I ended up at a small bar near the office. I texted Caleb, "Are you around?" 15 minutes later, he walked in, umbrella in hand, eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. His smile was soft. No questions, no judgment. Just presence. We talked. About nothing and everything. About dreams we'd abandoned. About people we used to be. About love, the real kind, the painful kind, the kind that asks everything of you and leaves you bleeding. I told him things I hadn't told anyone. I told him I felt like a ghost in my own life. That I'd done everything right and it still wasn't enough. That Daniel had made me feel small, disposable, replaceable. Caleb didn't speak right away. He just reached across the table and touched my hand. And in that moment, the floodgates opened, not tears, but something deeper. A craving. For connection. For warmth. For the feeling of being chosen. We didn't plan it. We didn't talk about it. But when we left the bar and he offered to drive me home, and I said yes, everything changed. When we reached my car parked nearby, I turned to thank him, and the words caught in my throat. He looked at me the way Daniel hadn't in years. Not with pity. Not with guilt. With want. With care. And when he leaned in to kiss me, I didn't stop him. It was soft at first. Then urgent. Years of silence and heartbreak poured into a single moment that felt both wrong and heartbreakingly right. My wedding ring felt like ice on my finger, but my body was on fire. I had crossed the line. The moment ended as quietly as it began. We didn't speak much after. He dropped me at home. I stood in the doorway of my house, soaked in guilt and confusion. I had done the one thing I swore I never would. I had become the person I used to judge. And yet, part of me didn't feel broken. Part of me felt like I'd finally been heard. The morning after was heavy. I woke up next to Daniel, just like I had for the past decade, but everything was different. Not because he knew. He didn't. He kissed my cheek, got dressed for work, and left like any other morning. It was because I knew. I had crossed the line. The guilt hit like a tidal wave, unexpected and consuming. I couldn't eat. Couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I thought the act would give me some sense of clarity, maybe even justice. But all I felt was shame. Not for the moment itself, but for what it revealed, how deeply broken I had become. That day, I called in sick and stayed home. I paced the kitchen, stared out the window, replayed everything again and again. Caleb's touch. His words. The way I let go of everything I had once vowed to protect. I was no longer just a victim. I had become a participant in the very betrayal I once feared most. But here's the strange part. Beneath the shame, I also felt something else: clarity. For months, I had been begging for scraps of love, pretending to be fine while slowly dying inside. I was loyal to a man who had emotionally abandoned me long before I ever looked at another. And in that moment with Caleb, I realized something brutally honest. I wasn't just angry at Daniel. I was angry at myself. For staying too long. For hoping too hard. For allowing myself to disappear in a marriage that no longer saw me. I sat down and wrote in my journal, a habit I had abandoned over the years. Page after page poured out of me. Memories, regrets, unanswered questions. But the final sentence was the one that hit me hardest. I'm not the same woman who made those vows, and he's not the same man I married. I didn't justify what I did. I didn't make excuses. But I finally told myself the truth. I had become lost. And it wasn't just Daniel's betrayal that did it. It was my silence. My fear of being alone. My unwillingness to admit when the love was gone. That night, I sat across from Daniel at the dinner table. He scrolled through his phone while I picked at my food. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. I wanted to say it. I wanted to tell him everything. Not to hurt him. Not to play the victim. But because I couldn't carry the weight of silence anymore. We were both drowning, just on opposite ends of the same sea. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I made a decision. The next conversation we had wouldn't be about blame. It would be about truth. Because no matter how messy or painful it would be, I had to face it. We both did. And only then could we decide whether to keep pretending or finally begin again. That weekend, I asked Daniel if we could talk, really talk. No phones, no distractions, no children in the next room. Just the two of us and the years between us that had become walls instead of bridges. He hesitated. "Is this serious?" he asked, as if our entire life hadn't already been falling apart behind a curtain of routine. I nodded. "It's serious." We sat in the living room, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, we looked at each other not as husband and wife, but as two flawed people who had once chosen each other, who now had to decide whether they still could. I went first. I told him everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't try to frame myself as the victim. I told him about how I'd seen the messages, about how I knew, about the months of pain I endured in silence, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through my fingers. And then I told him the part that hurt even me to say aloud. I told him about Caleb. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explode. He just stared at the wall, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow. I could see it happening, his image of me crumbling the way mine had of him. Then he finally spoke. He admitted it. The affair. That it had started with drinks, with flirtation, with texting late at night. And then it became more. He didn't love her, he said. It was about escaping the pressure, the routine, the feeling of no longer being wanted. But I never stopped loving you, he said. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But love doesn't look like silence. It doesn't look like avoidance, or lying, or pretending nothing is wrong. It doesn't feel like being alone when someone's still sleeping beside you. We sat in silence for a long time after that. And when we finally spoke again, it wasn't about blame, it was about choice. Did we want to stay together because we truly loved each other? Or were we just afraid of starting over? In the days that followed, we took time apart. He moved into a guest room. We agreed not to make any sudden decisions, not out of anger or guilt. And in that space, I healed. I focused on myself. I went to therapy. I reconnected with the version of me I had abandoned in favor of keeping a crumbling marriage afloat. I stopped asking, what did I do wrong, and started asking, what do I need? Eventually, we came back to the table. Daniel had started therapy too. And this time, there were no grand promises, no declarations of eternal love. Just honesty. We decided to try again, slowly, carefully. But only if we rebuilt it from the ground up, not on what we used to be, but who we were now. Because sometimes a line gets crossed not to break something, but to finally face the truth you've been too afraid to admit. And in that truth, painful, raw, and real, we found the beginning of something new. 31.